We have Stuart Hazeldine, a professor on carbon capture and storage at the University of Edinburgh. And we have Fernanda Veloso, the CTO of C-Questra, an organization that works on CCS. So Stuart, I think I'd like to sort of start with you to sort of set the stage in terms of what an expansion of CCS might look like in terms of technology. Where are the opportunities for this sector to expand in terms of what's technically feasible, and what might this look like in the next 10 to 20 years if expansion continues as much as I think everyone in this room hopes that it does?
Yeah, okay, thanks. So I guess the first thing to talk about is that there are several different methods of storing CO2 and storing CO2 for very long periods of time, which is something, the time dimension often gets forgotten. So when I'm talking storage of CO2, I'm talking timescales of 10,000 years and longer, because it's that type of timescale which we need for the atmosphere to get back to pre-industrial normal. So people who are planting trees are doing that in good faith, but the trees are going to grow for 10, 40, 50, 100 years. And that increases the carbon stock. It's captured very effectively, but it's not stored. So the storage we're talking about mostly in this meeting is geological storage, taking CO2 which can be made into a liquid and injecting deep down through oil and gas technology into porous reservoirs, where a cubic meter of rock may have 30% of that as pore space between the sand grains. So there are no lakes underground, there are no caves underground. It's very similar to an oil and gas field, and that metaphor has been used a lot in this meeting. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But also remember there is the possibility, emerging possibility of injecting into basalt rock, into using the reactive geochemistry of that rock. There's a completely different method of storage to make solid CO2 into solid minerals, which are there for permanently all time. And then other types of engineered removal, like making artificial rock, making artificial carbonate or artificial limestone. You can lock CO2 up in a very different way. But I'll go back to the geological storage because that's the one which has the most immediate scale-up opportunity and the one we're most familiar with. And there, we're in the North Sea region at the moment, we're storing about 1.5 million tons through the Norwegian projects every year for the project at the north of Norway, and then the Sleipner project in the northern part of the central part of the North Sea. And so we're trying to scale that up to something like 400 million tons a year by 2050 if we take European plus UK objectives. So it's a huge rate of increase. So that's going to require drilling lots of boreholes to put the CO2 in, because people will reuse some oil fields. Some of those boreholes will need replacing and reconditioning for CO2. Other people will be looking at aquifers where there's never been any oil or gas, so they're looking to find out about that structure for the first time. And that rate of drilling will require something like if we take 1 million tons a year per borehole, we'll need 400 extra boreholes to do that by mid-century. And that's easily achievable by analogy with the rate of oil and gas drilling and exploration in the North Sea. But nobody's going to do that ahead of time unless they can see where the profit's coming from. So we're talking about phase 1 projects just now, which have been 5 years, 9 years, 10 years, 11 years in gestation. Those will get going in the next 2, 3 or 4 years. So by 2029, we should have already been drilling to investigate the storage for the next wave of storage sites. And at the moment, there's no prospect of that happening at all, because there's no money in looking for the next wave of storage sites. So again, as is common in this meeting, we have the technical ability, we've got the track record, we have huge databases, thanks to the European states like Norway or the UK or Germany or France, who've had a lot of, or Italy, who've had a lot of oil and gas development. So we're ready to do this, but the financial incentives are not aligned with the timescale.
Sure. Well, that's a great segue. I want to bring in Fernanda to talk about sort of what this looks like from the industry perspective. Where do you see sort of, now that Stuart sort of laid out the technical challenges, where do you see the financing coming from? And also, where do you see the sort of, let's start with the financing, and we can get to the logistics later.
Thank you. Just one small word about C-Questra. We are a startup specialized in CO2 storage and transport onshore, because we believe that we have a huge potential onshore in Europe The problem is an unknown potential. In some countries, or it's in UK or historic oil and gas countries, we have a good knowledge of the underground, geological underground. But in other countries, we don't have this history. So the first problem is the risk related with exploration. In the oil and gas industry, when we find oil or gas, okay, jackpot. But here in CO2 storage, when we find a good reservoir, so let's try to do an injection test of CO2. So a lot of risk. And we think this part of the risk, exploration risk, should be shared between the company, government, scientific community, because we're not talking about secret. I mean, we are in C-Questra, our perspective is to be transparent. So everything related to CO2 storage will be public. And it's not only for CO2 storage. We can use also underground data for geothermal energy, for salt cavern exploration. I don't know, it's dependent of geological context. So we think this part of exploration risk should be shared between private and public institutions. This is a way to help in financing at least this part. And as we are looking for onshore storage, the costs are very low. So when we talk about one well, offshore well, we are talking about 20, 30, 40 millions to drill a single well. In onshore CO2 storage, an exploration program, the exploration program where seismic wells, etc., is around 20, 25 or 30 million. So all exploration program onshore is the cost of one well offshore. So I think this is a gap.
Yeah. This is where we get into the financing question. As much as I could drill into the details of sort of how to solve a financing question, I think that's been discussed in a lot of different panels. And I want to also just get into the logistics question. How do we sort of, if we identify these sites, then the next step is getting the, producing the carbon and getting it from, possibly from a very different place to a site like this. And that has its own costs. Stuart, do you want to take us through some of the logistical challenges?
Well, I think I'll just go back to a bit you skated over, is identifying the site. So we've got good appraisal offshore from the oil and gas legacy about where structures are, about where some of the sandstones are in between these structures. But that's completely different, certainly in the UK and I guess also in Norway, from actually getting the license to proceed. So any company that wants to, we had a presentation from the Crown Estate earlier on, and we had a presentation from the North Sea Transition Authority earlier on, who is responsible for doing the detail of these permits, because they have to look after the interests of the state and the country as well as the interests of the developer. And as part of that 8 or 9 year timescale can be 4, 5 or 6 years involved in preparing and submitting and negotiating different reports with these regulatory authorities who vary in their judgment between different European states. So there's a bit of flexibility there. But that process bridges the gap between what I'd call an academic or an in-principle identification of a site. So we could do a piece of work for a week and say this site could contain 30 or 50 or 100 million tons of CO2. But that's very different from the commercial certainty that a developer needs to show to a funder or to the regulatory authority. And quite often in oil and gas, there's an attrition rate, a failure rate of that process where the site doesn't actually measure up to commercial quality standards. So you could lose a third or half or even 3/4 of sites sometimes in that process. So let's not underestimate that. And then getting the CO2 there, then we're seeing on these potentially large sites we're seeing that's big enough for pipelines to be built and connected. And you're only going to do that if you've got the certainty of very large flows of CO2 to the site for the next 20 years or so to pay for the pipeline and get your money back, etc. And I think in the future, though, we're going to see a lot more diversity, a lot more rise of shipping tankers around the coastal shipping, use of barges, use of refillable trucks and even trains on land. So there's going to be multiple ways of both gathering the CO2 and then focusing it to concentrate offshore in single larger pipelines for economies of scale.
Sure.
And so there also needs to be a conversation about the pipeline quality of CO2. What's the analysis, the chemical mix of that CO2? Because different capture systems and different countries have different backgrounds in that, whereas the people who are responsible for the pipeline offshore and putting the CO2 underground need to understand that chemical mix, because that affects the flow properties and the chemical reactivity of that CO2 underground. So there's a whole bunch of things you need to align and a whole bunch of different analyses and agreements you need to make before you can be certain of proceeding. And at the end of all that, remember, we have not talked about, the developer may then operate that storage site for 20 years. But after that operation is finished, the developer is always looking for the national state to take over responsibility and liability for all the CO2 that's in the ground. And that's why this very long and complex presentation of do we know what we're doing is important. Monitoring and verification during injection is also really important as a preface to the final closure and the final handover of that site.
Absolutely. So Fernanda Stewart just painted a very elaborate picture of the whole life cycle of operation, transportation, site management. How do you take that and then operationalize it as somebody working in this space? What is the sort of technical, what does this look like on the ground? In 2
Let's
minutes.
go step by step. I mean, during the day, we talked about big, large-scale projects, big-scale projects. So let's start step by step. We start with one emitter, one site to prove, and then we can go further. I mean, we are jumping some steps here. We cannot just tomorrow say, okay, I can store all CO2 from France or from Europe. No, I need to test my reservoir. So everything needs to be tested, the transport, the connection with emitters. So this is the pilot phase. This is for this, to test all these steps, and then we can grow up, then we can scale up. So it's important to respect each step. So for example, we will not announce for everybody in the world that we have the big reservoir in France, onshore, and we can store our CO2 from the south of Europe. No. Why? Because we are locally. First, we work locally. First, let's see what we can do locally, decarbonize locally. And then everything is okay. We tested the reservoir, we tested the MMV plan, we tested the connection, the pipeline. So let's scale up. Let's see what we can connect. I think it's very important to respect this step. A project in south of France just they abandoned the project because it's so big. I mean, they start so big, so ambitious. So let's start locally to see locally for any reason, social, economical testing, etc., etc.
Absolutely.
Okay, and I just want to add one more thing to my cautious tale, that every CO2 project that's injected CO2 has had some surprises when the CO2 goes into the rock. So don't expect exact, precise predictions. It's a bit like the old military adage that no plan survives contact with the enemy. So when you put the CO2 in, then you discover what the storage site is like.
Well, on that very optimistic note, I'm afraid we're actually out of time. We weren't able to get to questions. We could have gone on for about twice as long.
Sure.
But the sort of surprises, I'm sure that both Stuart and Fernanda can talk about in more detail later today. But for me, I just like everyone to thank our panel for this whirlwind tour of all of the problems of implementation, and invite Vijay back to the stage for the next panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Very much.